Well, it really is such a pleasure to be here today. I've been a long admirer of the work here at the University of Washington, and especially in the area of teacher education. So it's really just an honor to be here to get to share some of my work with you. Ken asked me to come and talk about the work that Lauren Anderson and I have been engaged in around clinical experience. And so I'm going to share some of that work with you today, kind of trying to give you kind of the broad brushstrokes of what that body of work is about and kind of trying to do. And then what I'm going to try to do is kind of bring it around to kind of thinking about this work in the context of the practice-based approaches that all of you are kind of innovating here, to kind of try to think about kind of how lessons learned from this work on really kind of urban-focused clinical preparation and the role of teacher educators therein kind of might be considered as you're thinking about the practice-based work here that's so exciting and that so many folks are paying attention to right now. So you might be wondering, why did I get interested in student teaching? And I didn't become interested in it because Kate put out the Blue Ribbon report telling me, you know, you really should become more clinically based in your program and we need to document best practices. My interest emerged from my work as a teacher educator and from the real conundrums and the problems of practice that I was facing as I was trying to place student teachers. So as Ken mentioned, when I came out of UCLA, my first job was at Barnard College. And I finished my dissertation and pretty much got on a plane the next day and moved there. And when I got there, the first thing they told me I needed to do was find 20 student teaching placements for multiple subject candidates. So I never lived in New York, and I didn't know one teacher or one school in New York City. And they also wanted me to find those placements in schools that were considered high-need schools, the kinds of contexts where we would hope our graduates, as part of, you know, a social justice-oriented program, would go and find jobs. So as you can imagine, this was a daunting task. But I was especially concerned about this, about finding good placements because of the work that I had done in my dissertation, which was looking at how really skilled, equity-minded teachers navigated high-stakes accountability demands in low-performing schools in the area of literacy, right, which is one of the most legislated areas, and especially in classrooms with a lot of English learners in them. And what I found from that work was that, first of all, the high-stakes accountability demands were pretty much permeating every corner, every single dimension of teachers' work in that classroom, that it was no joke dealing with those demands, and that even really well-prepared, experienced, skilled teachers were struggling to do it well. And those who were doing it well, what they were doing was quite sophisticated and not something that a new teacher would likely be able to do on his or her own. So I was thinking about, how am I going to find the kinds of placements that are actually going to be educative for our students given these kinds of conditions that I know exist in schools that we would consider high-need schools. So obviously, this kind of mirrors this kind of long-standing tension in teacher education that Sharon Feynman Nemser has been talking about, right, since the 80s, which is this two worlds pitfall. This idea that kind of in the university, we try to really inculcate in our pre-service teachers these ideas about constructivist or inquiry-based teaching. And then when they go out into the classrooms in their field experiences, they see something that's quite different, right? And based on the work that I had done for my dissertation, I was especially concerned because now it wasn't just that there were these kind of more behaviorist approaches in place in schools, but there was also this kind of pervasive accountability culture in schools. And not only in teacher education were we kind of trying to promote a more constructivist approach to teaching, but then there were also a number of kind of urban-focused programs that were taking it to the next level and saying we really care about social justice, and we want to take this kind of beyond constructivism, right? So whereas Sharon Feynman Nemser talked about this two worlds pitfall, my sense was that this gap was actually much bigger right, than the one that she had described in the 80s and in the 90s, and a lot more complex, right? And so I wondered how, you know, how am I going to find placements that are going to be good placements? And so these were some of the questions that I was asking myself as I was trying to figure out where I should place student teachers. So where should they be? Who should they be with? How do we find enough good placements in high poverty schools? Right, I'm sure all these questions are familiar to you. These are the same questions, right, that most all teacher educators are asking themselves. And then I was asking, should we prioritize best possible cooperating teachers, or should we prioritize realistic placements? So should I find placements where teachers are modeling the kind of instruction that really mirrors what we're doing in the university, or should I find placements that have some of the real conditions that our teachers, when they graduate, are going to have to face and really contend with? So my good buddy, Lauren Anderson, from graduate school, was still in graduate school at the time, living in Los Angeles and working as a field supervisor. And we would have these conversations at night about these questions. We were really concerned about them. We had pretty much the exact same questions, the difference being that I actually had to find and secure the placements. And we started really kind of scratching our heads about, well, what is a good student teaching placement? And at the time, we didn't realize that people had been grappling with this question for a long time already. This is from 2002. There was a special issue in Teacher Education Quarterly. Ken actually wrote an article for it, where people are grappling with this exact same question of what is a good student teaching placement. And we read all these pieces in here, but we still kind of felt like we weren't exactly kind of able to get at the answer of what a good placement is. And eventually, we came, again, back to Sharon Feynman Nemser, to this question that she posed, again in the 80s. She kind of had it all going on already. But when is student teaching teacher education? And this is the question that I would say has really guided our work over the years, more so than what is a good placement. Because this question really kind of pushes us to look beyond the placement itself and to think about the kind of conditions for learning that we create around that placement, right, to ensure that it's in fact educative for the pre-service teachers who are placed there and that it moves them toward the learning goals that we have for them at the university. So I hope, as I kind of get into talking about the specific work, you can kind of see why we kind of gravitated toward this question, continue to, over what's a good student teaching placement. So as Ken mentioned, when we started out doing this work, well, he didn't say this part. I went out for a glass of wine with Christine Sleater, who had been in New York for AACTE, and she's been a longtime mentor of mine. And I said to her, Christine, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of work on student teaching in urban schools, and I have all these questions, and I think I maybe want to kind of study it. And she said, well, you really need to do a critical review of the literature. And of course, I'll listen to anything Christine Sleater tells me to do. So I said, okay. And little did I know that, for 5 years, this would dominate my life. But I will say, even though it was really insane, it was totally worthwhile in terms of really getting to know the field. So Lauren and I embarked on this journey together. We read, I would say, about 200 articles on student teaching. We were looking specifically at student teaching in urban schools. And the review ended up including about 50 articles that were published between 1990 and 2010 in peer-reviewed journals. And we didn't include descriptive studies. We were really just looking at kind of empirical work. We didn't look at evaluations and things like that. So what we found from this work was that there's considerable agreement about the importance of student teaching, right? That there kind of isn't any debate about the clinical dimensions of teacher education being really important. But we also found that there were a number of really notable gaps in the literature. So for one, believe it or not, there were very few studies that actually focused on student teachers learning. Very few research questions that actually centered learning. And also and kind of as part of that, kind of trying to understand the role that placements or cooperating teachers had in that learning. In addition, there were tons and tons of studies that focused on pre-service teachers developing beliefs, dispositions, attitudes, particularly toward urban communities, toward urban schools, toward urban students, whatever that means. And very few that focused on the development of practice. And as part of that, there were few studies that actually looked at the role of teacher educators in pre-service teachers' development. So oftentimes what we came to call the invisible hand was kind of teacher education was kind of the route that different authors took, was to kind of assume that teacher educators played some sort of role in pre-service teachers' learning, but to not really identify it as like this invisible hand of teacher education. And then there were also very few that examined teachers' work in the real context, student teachers' work in the real context where they were student teaching, like how they navigated the different kind of conditions surrounding their work. There were also a number of really notable limitations, but there were relatively impoverished views of teaching. So tending to kind of talk about teaching as a kind of performance or a set of strategies that could be kind of learned in one setting and then replicated in another. And very few that actually looked at teaching practice as the facilitation of student learning. There was also a tendency to assume that just being exposed to an urban school would actually enable you to become a good urban teacher. And so this idea that kind of immersion and independent practice would kind of alone kind of lead you on the path to excellent teaching, rather than really conceptualizing student teaching as a process of guided practice, right? A more kind of sociocultural approach to thinking about it. And then across the studies, there was a real tendency to talk about culture in these very reductive ways, to talk about urban kids, urban schools, to kind of treat them as if they were these kind of monolithic entities, that if you were in an urban school over here and an urban school over there, that they were necessarily the same, right? And there were similar tendencies to talk about pre-service teachers that same way, talk about white pre-service teachers of color, as if there was like, assumed kind of uniformity within those different groups. So the strengths in this body of literature, there were fewer strengths, but there was a subset of studies that we looked at that were really powerful. And these articles were really excellent at documenting the development of pre-service teachers' practice, and conceiving of that practice as the facilitation of student learning. But they also, in these same articles, were very clear about what contributed to that practice. So what were the kinds of factors that led to this development? What role did teacher educators play specifically in that development? What role did coursework play? What role did a cooperating teacher play? So given these kinds of findings, we made the argument that we really need research that starts to kind of do more of what these strong articles do, right? That really start to get at the development of practice, what contributes to the development of practice, but looking at it in really complex ways in relation to the context where the learning to teach process happens. So given what we were learning in this review, we decided to embark on our own cross-institutional study of student teachers in our two different programs. And these are the questions that guided us. What opportunities to learn and what constraints on learning do our pre-service teachers experience in urban high-need schools? And how do opportunities and constraints vary across placements? And with what implications for learning and teaching? So again, we were looking across the two different programs that we were working in. One in New York City, which was a small kind of boutique undergraduate program of multiple subject folks. And then a larger public two-year graduate program in Los Angeles. And something worth mentioning about that program is that in the first year of that program, it's a pretty typical teacher education program where students take courses, they engage in observation, they students teach. But in the second year, they're actually required to take full-time teaching positions in their own classrooms And then they're still engaged at the university in inquiry projects and seminars and things like that. So we have 32 participants overall, and 11 of them were actually first-year teachers at the time, so still enrolled in the Los Angeles program, but engaged in their own classrooms. And what we did with them was actually have them reflect back on their student teaching experiences in relation to their sense of preparedness as first-year teachers. We collected a variety of different sources of data, and we engaged in analysis kind of from the beginning and throughout the whole process. So I'm aging myself here. Is anybody going to recognize this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. I couldn't resist. So most of you are too young. There used to be this thing called Atari. Video games, and there was a game called Pitfall, and this is what it looked like. So the first general finding really assumed kind of what we had expected, which is that not only was there kind of a two worlds pitfall, but that this pitfall between what we were trying to teach at the university and the conditions that student teachers were experiencing in the classroom, that gap had just grown in size and that it had grown in complexity. And so even though there weren't necessarily kind of crocodiles looming below, but the stakes were still pretty high in terms of kind of what that gap presented. And this was mostly due to the fact that high stakes accountability demands in underperforming schools were so pervasive that it basically kind of infiltrated every part of the instructional day. So that had implications on two levels. On one level, it had implications for the learning to teach process, right? So what student teachers have opportunities to observe, to practice, and to receive mentoring around in their field placements, right? Because in many of the classrooms, there were teachers who were actually reading from scripts, okay, for 2 to 3 hours a day while they were doing the mandated language arts program, right? Or using a pacing calendar, so they had to be on this lesson on this day, and this lesson on the next day, and this lesson on the next day, and then on Friday, the whole school goes through an assessment, and then on Monday, the results are posted in the hallway, right? So this has real implications for the kinds of practices that the student teachers were seeing. But there's also implications for the kind of knowledge that teachers in high poverty schools need to have and develop. So in other words, the nature of teachers' work in high poverty schools has changed. And the changes aren't peripheral or minor, which complicates questions about which placements are most educative. So because the policy contexts are so consequential, it probably wouldn't be wise to assume that learning to teach well in one context will necessarily translate to another context. So in addition to considering which instructional approaches and stances toward teaching we want our candidates to develop through their placements, we also need to consider which context will best prepare them to then thrive, right, in the kinds of schools where we really want them to take jobs. So let me just frame this a little bit differently. Saying kind of the same thing, but just framing it in a slightly different way. So Linda Darling Hammond kind of lays out a view of professional practice that includes 3 different knowledge domains of teaching, right, that an adaptive expert needs in the classroom. And that, this doesn't show up very well. It's a Venn diagram. But this idea that teachers need to have knowledge of subject matter and curriculum goals, they need to have knowledge of learners and their development in social context, and they need to have a knowledge of teaching or pedagogy, right? And what we found in our study was that in most cases, our student teachers did not develop this view of professional practice, that they really developed a compromised view of professional practice in all of these 3 areas as a result of the policy and the political context that they were working in. Or at least this was certainly a mediating factor in them being able to learn about these other things. And so we made the argument that we really need to be considering a 4th domain, that if we're preparing teachers for particular contexts, and teachers need to be able to navigate these real conditions in order to be able to master these other knowledge domains, then we have to take it up seriously in teacher education, and especially in teacher education programs that are like specialized programs, that are programs that aim specifically to prepare teachers for urban and high-need schools, like the programs that we were working in. So, So to help characterize the kinds of contexts that I've been referring to and to give you a better sense of the placement conditions that gave rise to this fourth domain, I'm going to spend just a little time talking about the aspect of our study that focused on our participants who, as first-year teachers, reflected on student teaching's contributions to their own preparedness to teach in urban high-need schools. So some of you have maybe read this piece. I know Ken distributed it. It's the piece that was published in JTE in 2011. So I'm just going to kind of skim over some of that to just show what these different contexts look like, because I think it's important to establish this as a foundation to see that not all of the placements were exactly the same, and that's kind of the point. So the participants were 11 female first-year teachers, and again, they were reflecting on their participation in 2 different student teaching placements the year before. As you can see, it was a diverse group of pre-service teachers, racially, and they were placed in classrooms from kindergarten through 5th grade. These are multiple subject candidates. And you can see here that there's actually kind of a range in the kinds of classrooms that they were placed in. So some were placed in bilingual classrooms because they were getting bilingual credentials. Some were placed in inclusion classrooms. Waiver to basic in Los Angeles means bilingual because of Proposition 227, which eliminated bilingual education in 1998. Now we're seeing kind of a resurgence of bilingual ed. But for many years, parents have had to sign a waiver to allow their kid to participate in bilingual education. So they're called waiver to basic classrooms. And then when Proposition 227 passed, we also had the joy of bringing in something called structured English immersion, which goes against everything we know about educating English learners. Since people learn language in context and in relation to content, it's important to teach language through content. But in these classrooms, the idea is that we're just going to teach language in isolation, outside of any of the content areas, and then once kids master the language and redesignate as fluent English proficient, they can go into the regular classrooms and then they can catch up with the content at that time. So we have folks that are placed in all of these different kinds of classrooms. And it's worth noting that a lot of the teachers in these SEI classrooms were actually former bilingual teachers, but when the bilingual programs went away, they ended up taking jobs in these kinds of classrooms. So there were a number of different kind of themes that came up across all of the student teaching placements. But what was interesting about these thematic findings, I'm not going to read them now because I'm going to kind of go into each of them in a little bit of detail, but is that there wasn't uniformity in how they presented themselves. So for certain placements, there was a lot of pressure to follow mandates with fidelity, but in other placements, there wasn't. And so we had some ideas kind of about why this was the case, and we were kind of, because we've been in the data so much, and then we had this idea, what if we kind of arrayed these different placements according to these kind of different axes of coherence. And I'll explain a little bit about that in a second. But to help us get a better sense of why we're seeing this variation across the different placements. So, like I said, we call them kind of, axes of coherence, which was an exciting thing for us to do because it allowed us to connect with some of the work that's been done by people like Pam Grossman and others who understand the importance of coherence in teacher ed. The idea that candidates stand to benefit when there's coherence across courses within a certain program, but then also coherence between the program and the placements that they're in. But we were thinking about coherence in slightly different ways. So here, this kind of vertical axis that we see has to do with the degree to which the placement is coherent, the context of the placement is coherent with the kind of context that we want our student teachers to eventually find jobs in. So you can see here at the top, we have the kind of real policy conditions that are at play kind of everywhere, but the tightest kind of regulation around those policies. So Chris Gutierrez has written about this idea that, you know, these tight reforms just exist right now, these reforms that are really close to schools' technical core, right, teaching and learning, but that in certain contexts, and especially the schools that serve racially and linguistically diverse kids and poor kids, that there tends to be much tighter scrutiny, right, around those. She calls those tight school contexts. And in contrast, there are tight, loose school contexts, right, where the tight reforms exist, but maybe sometimes even just in the background, right, because they're only loosely monitored. So at the top, we have kind of the tightest policy conditions, okay? And then from left to right, we're looking at coherence in the more kind of typical way, thinking about coherence pedagogically and philosophically, the degree to which the teaching in the placement kind of mirrors the teaching in the approaches to teaching in the teacher education program. And so the way that we were kind of thinking about this is that ideally we're really trying to prepare teachers to be quadrant B teachers, right? We want them to work in the tight contexts, right, where they're having to deal with, where they're in a low-performing school, a high-need school, but where they're able to actually engage in the kinds of practices that their teacher education programs are hopefully preparing them to engage in. Any questions about this? That was a mouthful, huh? Okay. And so we arrayed our placements in relation to these axes. And this really helped us to understand a great deal. So I don't know if you can see this, but the white placements are English-only placements. The kind of light blue are bilingual placements. And the black here is a structured English immersion placement. Okay, so that kind of in and of itself is kind of interesting to just see kind of where things land. And then we also noticed that there were things kind of clustered in these bands. So this is band 1, across the middle is band 2, and across the top is band 3. So band 1, where we see kind of the loosest monitoring of accountability demands, are lower grade classrooms for the most part, right? So they're kindergarten and first grade, where teachers don't actually have to administer high stakes tests, okay? So we can see that's why those went across the bottom. There were also some placements there where they had very strong principals who were buffering teachers from some of the high stakes accountability pressures that were coming down from the district and the state. In band 2, we actually see a number of the bilingual placements. And what's interesting about these placements is that even though they were under significant pressure, because a lot of those classrooms were populated mostly by English learners, in some ways, they were under less pressure to follow mandated curriculum because they were teaching in Spanish, right? Which was not going to be tested on high-stakes tests. So while during part of the day there was a great deal of scrutiny, there were also parts of the day where they had quite a bit of autonomy, actually, in their instruction. And then across the top in band 3, we have most of the structured English immersion and just the monolingual English-only classrooms. And those were the classrooms where there were under the most pressure to follow the mandated curriculum in literacy. Okay, so what I was saying is that I'm just going to kind of take you through how these different themes presented themselves across these different quadrants so that you can see a little bit of the variation and also kind of what we mean by these themes. So one of the things that the student teachers seemed to learn was how to struggle on behalf of kids, right? Was to really kind of learn how to advocate on behalf of the students in their classrooms. So in these two placements, these were actually really horrible placements by any standard, where the cooperating teachers were engaged in terrible teaching practices, but also engaged in really dehumanizing kind of interactions with the students in their classes. So here, Mireya says, talking about her cooperating teacher, talking about the kids in the class, she said, if she thought they, smelled bad, she called the students, the children, stinky. It was just so degrading. And then here we have Eliza saying it was first grade, a lot of newly arrived students not really even having a strong foundation in their home language, and they're learning English, and they're learning how to read. She would snap her fingers in their face. She would do all the things that you would never do as a teacher, and that was like her best practice. She didn't plan. So I'm sure all of us who work in teacher ed have had student teachers in classrooms where things like this happen, right? And the way that the student teachers described their work in these classrooms was engaging in damage control, where they were really trying to protect the kids from these kinds of dehumanizing experiences. And by engaging in more kind of loving and caring relationships with the kids, right? Also trying to leverage the resources that the kids brought with them in these very kind of transparent ways. And also, whenever possible, trying to model for the cooperating teachers some of the things that they were learning in teacher education when they had opportunities to do this. So, you know, it would be difficult to say that these were educative student teaching placements. I mean, they were educative in terms of moral agency and advocacy, but not in terms of practice. And I think, you know, as teacher educators, we really need to be thinking about this as just kind of a side note about what our role should be when we have folks in these kinds of placements. Because traditionally, teacher ed programs just kind of stand by when things like this are happening. So other folks talked about their cooperating teachers only following mandates, right, which had implications for their learning to teach, but with fidelity, or they ignored the mandates altogether. And these were both named as beneficial, but also problematic. So here we have in quadrant A, the teachers who were following the script with a lot of fidelity. And so Talia, talking about her cooperating teacher, it was always, no, just follow the script. Do it that way. And Ray saying, she would basically say, you should do what they want you to do in the book during that segment. We have this many days for this chapter, and we're going to get through it. And it didn't really take into account the individual needs of the students. Okay, so this is happening on one side. So obviously, the student teachers actually thought this was beneficial in the sense that they became familiar with the mandated curriculum that they were going to have to use the following year. But they didn't have any opportunities to engage with the program adaptively, to engage in any kinds of formative assessment or any other learner-centered practices. Now, meanwhile, in quadrant C, we had student teachers who were in classrooms where the mandates were being ignored completely. So here Gail's saying she all but ignored the mandated literacy curriculum. That wasn't very helpful as a new teacher coming in, knowing the mandated curriculum so well that I can feel confident in changing parts of it because I can answer to the bureaucrat that walks through the door and says, what are you doing? So she really felt like she was disadvantaged as a new teacher because she had no familiarity with the program and therefore felt that she couldn't use it adaptively. Okay? So I think going into the study, Lauren and I assumed this would be great, right, to have a cooperating teacher who ignored the mandated curriculum. But as it turned out, this teacher felt like it didn't prepare her for the kinds of conditions that she needed to contend with. A bunch of the student teachers also talked, the first year teachers talked about these opportunities to amass images of what's possible in the classroom, but not having a sense of how to get there themselves. So here we have Susie saying, because it was so positive, it was like I could hold on to the happy thoughts of student teaching to get me through the first year. It was like the light at the end of the tunnel. I can get there. I just have to get through this first. So that was really positive to get to see up here in quadrant B some really excellent teaching, right? But then as Ray explains, without the model, you don't even know where you want to go. At least with the model, you know where you want to go. You just have to figure out yourself how to get there, right? And the student teachers talked about not knowing themselves how to get there. Susie says, it was hard for me to understand what they did to get there because already it was a well-oiled machine. And taking it for granted and not realizing how to develop it because it was already there when I walked in. I never planned with either teacher, which is something I also wish I could have done. But it's like experienced teachers don't really plan, it seems. Okay, so here we saw this theme kind of going across all of the placements where there was very little access to planning and also very little access to the kind of backstage labor that teachers engage in, right? And particularly around the mandated curriculum. Now, in these placements up in Quadrant B, especially in the bilingual classrooms and also in the structured English immersion classrooms where there were former bilingual teachers, student teachers were really exposed to pedagogies that were grounded in ideological clarity and this kind of anti-deficit student-centered teaching. And this was a result of bilingual teachers and former bilingual teachers really feeling like their programs were at risk of going away and feeling like they had to be able to advocate for students and advocate for their programs, and they were very kind of public in their kind of political stance about their work, and the student teachers were certainly exposed to this. And they were also exposed to the kinds of practices that would be important in a bilingual program. So really worked and working together, participating and presenting, talked to the parents, brought in extra stuff all of the time, extra materials, realia, role play, so she's naming all these things. The system, what it is for English learners, they must be able to speak for themselves, to advocate for themselves, right? And Juliana is talking about our cooperating teacher. She says, knowing that people really don't want this program around, if you're going to be a bilingual teacher, you better be a really, really good teacher. You better know your shit. Okay, so they came out of these placements, even though there were tight policy conditions with this real sense of ideological and pedagogical clarity, even if they didn't always know how to kind of get there themselves. So across all the placements, student teachers were critical of the mandated curriculum, and they talked about the need to change it. But they talked about this in very superficial ways, mostly in terms of supplementing the curriculum, but not being able to adapt it, transform it, and certainly not being able to actually create curriculum from scratch, which almost none of them actually had the opportunity to do. So you can see here, these are some of the ways that they talked about supplementing. Adding that think, pair, share, little things that you can do to bring in their cultures, making it fun, getting them hooked, doing it with your own pizzazz. So actually not really disrupting the curriculum in any way, but kind of just tinkering with it, supplementing it. So when we were trying to then kind of understand what led to these different conditions and these different outcomes in relation to the different placements, a few different things became really evident to us. One, instructional coherence is really important. Instructional coherence meaning with the program. That contextual coherence is also really important, right? Which was kind of a groundbreaking thing. We thought that it really did matter being in a classroom that looks like the kind of classroom that you're going to teach in the following year. But sadly, neither of these things were enough to kind of ensure that the student teachers actually came away mastering the goals that we have for them in teacher education. And this seemed to be the result of, one, cooperating teachers not kind of having the resources or being connected enough to the program to be able to facilitate their learning in relation to those goals. And then the big doozy, not pointing the teachers at the finger at the cooperating teachers, is looking at the university teacher educators and their near absence in facilitating learning in relation to the learning goals and in relation to the different contexts where the student teachers were placed. And that was devastating to us, both of us as university teacher educators who were supervising, right? So I'm going to zoom in a little bit to give you kind of a sense of what this looked like, and if the other article that Ken distributed it kind of tells this story in more depth. So one of the student teachers was named Cristina, and Cristina was a really sharp student teacher, super committed. She had grown up in Los Angeles, first generation college student. She'd been an English learner herself, engaged in her community, and brought these amazing resources to the table as a new teacher, and was very familiar really with the community funds of knowledge, and was incredibly committed to working in the community where she grew up. So we asked her to talk with us about when, oh, and she actually student taught, this is a second grade placement, and the following year she became a teacher in a second grade classroom. So there was actually a lot of congruence between the placement where she had student taught and then where she took her first job. So when we were interviewing her, one of the questions we asked is, can you think of a time when in teacher education you, or in your placement, when you were able to take something you had learned in teacher education and then you were able to apply it in your placement, you were able to practice it in your placement. And so as many of the student teachers who were getting bilingual credentials did, they talked about this beloved instructor they had and introduced them to all these wonderful strategies to use with English learners. And one of the things that he had talked with them about was kind of visually representing ideas to help kind of get to deeper content instead of having it be so text heavy. And so she was doing a unit as part of the Open Court scripted reading program on camouflage. And she had this idea that she would have the kids make a mural like they had done in her bilingual methods class. And so she talks here a little bit about what she did. She said, during the mandated literacy program's camouflage unit, since we were doing desert life and wildlife, I got large butcher paper and I cut it in half. I brought in groups and I said, on this side we're going to draw what you see in a rainforest. They started drawing trees and leaves. And then I started seeing them drawing crosses and rest in peace on the desert side. At the same time, I was hearing in the news about immigration, how people were going through the desert and they were dying and there was no water. And I started making sense of it and I asked them, why are you doing crosses? Oh, for the people that are dying because they want to come over here. I didn't want to stop it and I didn't want to steer the direction of the mural, so I just let it be. So it was like they were really on their own and also culturally working together. We, meaning her cooperating teacher, and she talked about it very minutely. Okay, so this is a really powerful example, right, for a lot of different reasons. And I think it's also just an incredible accomplishment on the student teacher's part that she was actually able to do this during her student teaching placement. But it's also an example of what student teaching looks like when it's conceptualized as independent practice. Because she, on her own, doesn't actually recognize the opportunity that this presents to her for leveraging the knowledge that kids bring to the table to facilitate new and deeper learning, right? She just let it be, right? And treated this as a standalone activity, right? And then was on to something else the next day. When really you think about the second graders having this knowledge, what an opportunity for learning, right? And for so many other things, for community building, for engagement that this presented. And so we started to then think about, well, what would it look like if a university teacher, educator, actually had access to this? What if the university supervisor actually knew the student teacher this well and knew the context that she's student teaching in so well that he or she could then kind of facilitate this learning further? And so we started to kind of imagine what that would look like. And to help us, we turned to theory, which for the graduate students here, if you hate theory, it really is your friend and can really help you, I think, so deeply about things. And so we turned specifically to cultural historical activity theory. And I'm going to just kind of take you into that for a couple minutes here. So, again, I should have gone to this first. One of my graduate students drew this, and I thought it was so apt, kind of, what is our job as teacher educators in helping teachers learn, right? How to kind of bridge this pitfall between the university and the classrooms. So we turned to chat for a few different reasons. And we're not the only ones using chat, obviously, to understand teacher education. There are a bunch of folks who are doing that work, and there's lots of really great stuff coming out. But here we've turned to it because we feel like it's uniquely suited to help us build on strengths and also address some of the limitations and gaps that we highlighted in our literature review. Namely, because it foregrounds learning, right? It emphasizes the mediating role of context, and it addresses culture with complexity. So these are issues that are pertinent everywhere, but are of particular concern to us when we're preparing student teachers for and placing them in urban high-need schools where they have to contend with contextual factors, like the prevalence of high-stakes accountability demands. So from a CHAP perspective, to understand learning, you have to also understand the social, cultural, and historical contexts where learning occurs, and where the experiences of subjects, in this case, pre-service teachers, are mediated by artifacts and rules, and we're all community members, including cooperating teachers, university teacher educators, K-12 students, negotiate the distribution of tasks, powers, and responsibility. This collective notion of learning is also referred to as an activity system, which we see represented graphically here, and I'll use this as a conceptual map to consider Christina's experience. So here we kind of blew out, or exploded out, the activity system heuristic to kind of get a sense of the different mediating artifacts, right, that were shaping Christina's opportunities to learn. So here we have immigration and language policies, media coverage right, about immigrants crossing in the desert, California's performance and content standards, open court reading, standardized tests, TEP assignments, all these different things are mediating artifacts, right? And then all of these different kinds of rules and divisions of labor, all of these different things are contributing to the conditions the conditions for learning, because they're part of the context that she's learning in. And one of the reasons that this is so useful is it helps to really kind of present the different tensions and contradictions and discoordinations that are part of the learning context, right? We know that when we put her out there in that classroom, it's not just smooth sailing, that there are all these opportunities for tensions to arise, and it's at those junctures where she's most at risk of developing a compromised view of professional practice, right? Where she's not developing kind of mastery of those different knowledge domains. And so we were looking at this, and we were trying to think about how would we facilitate her learning, right? Given all of these different factors and given the example that she gave us about how she was applying her teacher ed understandings in placement. So initially, Christina talks about this mural project, right, as a standalone activity. But we started thinking about what if we were the teacher educator and we wanted to push this a little bit further and help her see this as a bigger opportunity than as a standalone project. So maybe we would sit down and we would ask her, what were your goals for learning here, right? Because having them work together culturally is not really a learning goal, right? So what was the learning goal, right? And then to help her start, once she does that, seeing the potential connections that were here. So we turned to the California Social Studies standards, and we found 3 standards immediately that connected with the topic of immigration. Differentiate between things that happened a long time ago and yesterday, demonstrate map skills by describing absolute and relative locations of people and places, and explain governmental institutions and practices in the US and other countries. We also saw that there were ways to connect to science, right? I mean, she's talking about these different ecosystems and the desert in particular, and that there were opportunities to connect there. And it was also an opportunity to bring some kind of coherence to these otherwise really fragmented units in the open court program, which kind of, they're very discrete units and they just get tacked onto each other, but there's no connection across them. And so we were thinking about, this could actually be, if we remediated her learning in relation to the mediating factors at play, a whole unit on immigration that could have social studies components, science components, and language arts being pulled through it, as opposed to a standalone activity. So obviously this is just one example of what teacher educators remediation, not like slowing it down, but mediating or reorganizing the learning conditions in relation to the mediating artifacts that are already at play. So, and more recently, we've been kind of playing with this a little bit more. We have a paper coming out in Urban Education. It was just published online, and it's called Minding the Mediation. where we actually look at my mediation or remediation of two student teachers learning. And it's not an effort to say, oh, Jamie's practice is best practice and it should be replicated elsewhere. It's really to try to kind of get inside the complexity of individual learners and individual contexts and how mediation has to vary in relation to that. And so when we started out with this, we're focusing on my mediation of two student teachers learning. These student teachers are both white, the same age, went to an elite liberal arts college, okay, super good students, and they were placed in the same grade level, blocks apart, okay? It'd be super easy to assume that they were having the same experience, right? And that we should kind of scale up and figure out what the best practice is for mediating their learning, because for these two, it's got to be the same. But if you dig a little bit deeper, one school context has a dual immersion and an inclusion model. It's an underperforming school. Most of the kids walk to school, and 85% of them are students of color. 70% of them come from poverty, and there's tight monitoring of the district mandated curriculum. Meanwhile, the teacher candidate who's in there as a learner has a highly developed structural critique of society. She comes from this family of activists. Her grandparents were active in the Socialist Party. So she came in not only with this really well kind of developed intellectual critique, but also saw herself as an activist and was not afraid to push back on structures that she thought were problematic or instruction that she didn't feel comfortable with. Her cooperating teacher actually had some problems with her because she was so strong. She's a fabulous teacher now. And then school context, too, was a totally different setting. It was a really kind of arts-based curriculum where they talked a lot about learning by doing, project-based. It was a high-performing school. Only 40% students of color, and most of those kids were bused in from the Bronx to diversify their campus. And they had very loose monitoring of district-mandated curriculum. Now, the second teacher candidate was far less critical than teacher candidate one. And she also had an art background herself, so she had this tendency to be very uncritical of the kinds of things that she saw in her placement classroom. She, even if the teacher was doing things that were marginalizing 80% of the kids in the class, if it was creative, she tended to think that it was a good thing to be doing. And she also had a tendency to focus a lot on management, kind of make sure things were running well. So what we did in our analysis, and I'll really go through this quickly, is we tried to see the kinds of forms of mediation the forms of mediation that I engaged in with these different student teachers, and then the functions those different forms played. And then we tried to look at the kind of different focus or foci of those different forms of mediation. So while there was some uniformity in the forms, and the function and the foci, it played out very differently for the different teachers. So for example, Jen, who's the more critical one, and she's in a bilingual classroom, she was really mad because they were going to have a performance at the school and the principal was making them do it all in English. And she said, this is absurd, we're a dual immersion program, it should be in Spanish. And so, she was ready to kind of go into the office and raise hell and, as a student teacher, kind of get into a fight and undermine her own opportunities. So this is a chance for me to work with her on how to be a professional, to learn about kind of the history of her school, who her principal is, why he might do things the way he does, and so to familiarize her with the kind of politics of her school, the history of her school, and then to talk with her cooperating teacher to kind of get her perspective on why things are the way they are. Now, here we have Marie, who's the less critical teacher, and she's just talking about, I did such a great job today. The class paid attention, and I can keep the class running smoothly, right? So she's somebody who does not tend to take a critical perspective, and so here I'm pushing her to consider, well, what do you mean when you say the classroom's running effectively? Who was it effective for? And what makes a classroom effective? So you can see, these are just small things, right? But it's really looking at variation in learner, variation in context, but also variation in the learner-context fit. Because if these student teachers were placed in different placements, the mediation would have to look different. So Jen would experience Marie's placement very different than Marie is experiencing it. So this seems like a no-brainer, right? For most of us who have ever written responses in student teachers' journals before, right? That it has to be individualized. But there is a lot of press right now from policymakers to really scale it up and document best practices. And I think that this starts to kind of highlight just how complex the learning is, and that we have to be attuned to the variation and vary our own mediation accordingly. So all of this this body of work has a number of implications. One, just kind of going back to the fact that theory is our friend. So chat really served as a valuable magnifying glass for us, and also a magnifying mirror for our own practice, helping us to see more clearly the factors that mediate the learning of student teachers like Christina and Jen and Marie, and how we need to remediate accordingly so that student teachers are equipped to analyze context and culture and to adapt, and in this case, adapt mandated curricula and learn how to remediate their own students' learning. Second, the line of research has really helped us see the importance of setting clear learning goals for student teaching. What do we think it should accomplish? What burden can it really shoulder? And what role should teacher educators play in ensuring that it actually accomplishes the goals that we think it should have? In terms of thinking about learning goals, we also were thinking about Christina's situation partly being a problem of there not being a shared goal between the cooperating teacher and the teacher educators at the university. Right? Now this is a well-documented problem. Ken's written a lot about the need to really engage cooperating teachers in determining what the goals are, right? And Ingestrom, who comes from the world of chat, and I don't know how to say the other person's name, have talked about this as what they call a common object problem or a common goal problem. But they also make clear that we can't really expect there to ever be complete agreement about what goals are, and that goals, we should really be thinking about them more as like horizons that we're all kind of aiming towards, and that if we come to common horizons, which is actually perhaps more doable than common goals, that we might kind of make strides towards more coherent practice. So it also really helped us think about focusing on the development of practice, and how not just focusing on practice, but that the developing practice has to be more visible to teacher educators at the university if we hope at all to be able to facilitate their learning in relation to the development. I think I probably don't even need to say we need to take the policy context seriously. When I went through teacher education, I was told, just close your door and do what's right. And for the most part, teacher education still operates like that. In the schools where I supervise teachers, nobody has the freedom to close their door. And we really need to teach teachers explicitly how to engage with the policy context in a productive way. So what's really cool is that practice-based approaches, the stuff that you all are engaged in here, begins to do all of this stuff, right? It focuses on pre-service teachers learning, on their development of practice, and it's very clearly delineated what the goals are. From the stuff that I've read, the goals that you have for pre-service teachers learning seem much clearer to me than in the 200 articles that I read for the Lit Review. Something else that I think is a wonderful stride in the right direction is involving classroom teachers in developing the goals, which is clear you're doing with the teachers who are engaged with you around the practice-based work. This idea that university teacher educators need to have access to the kinds of practices and the kinds of contexts where our student teachers are engaged is also something that the practice-based approaches really deal with, that proximity is just built into the structure of practice-based approaches. And it also really enables this varied mediation because you're actually there watching the student teacher engage with kids, right, and in relation to learning. And you're also doing this great job of making the hand of teacher education visible not just by being there and facilitating their learning, but then writing about it here in a way that others can learn from it, really showing the role that teacher educators play. But I also want to suggest that there are some things we really need to be thinking about in relation to the practice-based approaches. If we really care about equity and we really think context is as consequential as I think it is. So one of the things that really struck me, and I'm guessing, Mark, this maybe came from your folks in science, is one of the articles that I read, and I read a bunch of them, so I don't know which one now, but said that some of the science teacher candidates here were struggling to transfer what they had learned in their more kind of practice-based approaches to real classrooms when they were student teaching. So that when they were in the practice-based kind of lab, right, that they were able to engage in these more inquiry-oriented practices, but then when they went into their real student teaching placements, they didn't actually have the freedom to engage, right, in the way that they wanted to. And I would just like to suggest that this, my sense is that this would be the case for multiple subject teachers in the area of mathematics and in the area of literacy. And I think that it's safe to say that pre-service teachers can't bridge this gap on their own. And in fact, new teachers can't bridge it on their own either. And that for years, for decades, we put the burden on pre-service teachers to navigate this 2 worlds pitfall, which has now become like the 10 worlds pitfall. And they're not developmentally ready to navigate it. It's actually unfair to expect them to do it, and then we throw up our hands and say, well, we did all these good things, but now they're not doing it. So I just want to suggest that when we all think about kind of mediated field placements, that we kind of take that to the next step, and we think about what would it look like to then remediate, right? To help student teachers, pre-service teachers, bridge the gap between the practice-based classroom and their real student teaching classroom. To not just expect them to move from context to context and be able to recontextualize on their own, especially when there are real hurdles to them engaging in the work. That I think if we really want the learning to stick, we have to think about that piece seriously. I feel like Ken should get up and talk, do this part. So it seems like you're making some really great strides here in working with the teachers, engaging with teachers in the practice-based classrooms that you're working with. But that doesn't in and of itself kind of take care of the perennial kind of triad student teaching problem that we have of cooperating teachers not really being part of the conversation. And so I think it would be really important to think about what can we learn from those relationships that we've developed with the practice-based teachers, and how can that inform the way we work with cooperating teachers in the bulk of the student teaching placements where we're placing our folks. Sorry. So, and this is kind of where we can be thinking about the idea of developing horizons together. It seems like, or goals together, it seems like in the practice-based classrooms that's happening, but perhaps it's not happening in the rest of the placements. And this would be really important if we're committed to remediating the learning that's happening in those, in the traditional student teaching placements. As Ken mentioned, I've become a lot more interested in the preparation of the next generation of teacher educators. And so I work actually in one of the nation's only programs that sets out to prepare teacher educators. It's an EDD program. Etta Hollins started it. And we have classes on the pedagogy of teacher education, the curriculum of teacher education. Folks come into the program to become practitioners, teacher educators. And I can say pretty confidently that even after taking that pedagogy course, they're not equipped to engage in this kind of mediation work or in the practice-based approaches that you guys are doing here. So I think we really need to be thinking hard together about what the preparation of the next generation of teacher educators is going to involve, and to really think hard about kind of how we do that work across settings and with equity really kind of at the center of what we're thinking about. So to that end, I've been unsatisfied at USC with kind of how deeply our program can go. And so for about 2.5 years, I've been facilitating these monthly kind of informal learning sessions with a group of aspiring and practicing teacher educators in LA. And it's based on Paulo Freire's notion of culture circles and the critical cycle, and we engage in dialogue around equity-related problems of practice in teacher education. And it's a really exciting space for learning. In the last year, we've actually kind of morphed. People were getting frustrated with kind of stopping with dialogue. And so we started kind of experimenting with teatro, or theater of the oppressed, and where we reenact certain things that have happened, interactions between a teacher educator and a student teacher, or the head of a department and a newer teacher, or between a veteran teacher and a principal. So there are reenactments of practice, there are rehearsals of kind of what different responses might look like. And in some ways, it actually kind of mirrors the practice-based work that you're doing with pre-service teachers here. And so I think that that's something that's potentially really promising, is to kind of think about what might a practice-based approach that's really kind of grounded in problems of practice look like at the doctoral level, kind of in a formal learning context for the preparation of teacher educators. And I also think, just kind of connecting to Ken's work on the democratization of teacher education, that this kind of space is exactly the kind of hybrid space where we can kind of develop those more horizontal relationships and dissolve those hierarchies, because it really is a place that is constructed as a learning space, but as an informal learning space, those kind of status markers kind of melt away. The practitioners have as much to learn from researchers as researchers have to learn from practitioners. And I wonder if that kind of space could be the kind of space where cooperating teachers, because a bunch of the folks in our group are cooperating teachers, where school-based educators and university-based educators come together to wrestle together, right? Where it's a learning, where it's constructed as a learning space for everyone, not as a space where the university supervisors are engaging the cooperating teachers in professional development, right? So, and I can say myself, you know, I started the group, and I can't believe how much I learn every time, and how it's so refreshing for me to go and to meet these really experienced classroom-based folks. And then finally, I think it would be wonderful to kind of keep talking about this idea of core practices and to expand the way we think about them. And so I've been really impressed with the University of Washington branch of the core practice group, because I can see in the writing that you're doing here these real efforts to identify practices that are meant to be contextualized, that are not oversimplified, and they're not meant to be replicated in simplistic ways. But I also think that we can kind of take this even a step further, to be thinking about the kinds of practices that student teachers need to be engaged in if we expect them to be successful in the kinds of contexts that I've been talking about today, where there are real policy demands that they have to contend with in a real way. So might a core practice be learning how to adapt mandated curriculum and all of the kind of different dimensions of that? What does it look like instructionally to do that work, the technical work of doing it? But then what does it look like when your principal comes in your classroom and you're not following the curriculum? What does that conversation involve, right? Or also core practices that really start to get at kind of cultural competence in a deeper way, to think about the relational dimensions of teaching and not in a loosey-goosey way. But what does it look like to perhaps have student teachers learn how to write dialogue journals with students and to really get to know them and the cultural and linguistic tons of knowledge that kids bring? And then what does it look like to leverage that in relation to a mandated curriculum? So I think that there's a lot of power in the core practice work, but I also think that there's a lot of risk in people taking it up in reductive ways. And so I guess that's just kind of where I want to end, which is, you know, how grateful I think people are in the teacher ed community that there's this vibrant place like the University of Washington that's engaged in all this really innovative work and writing about it, and I think folks are excited about it and learning about it. But I also think it raises the stakes for you because people are paying attention and people are talking about it. And so I think given that, I think we have to just really think hard about kind of where equity kind of sits in the work and kind of what role it plays in it, in the conversations moving forward. And I hope that I can continue to be part of that conversation beyond today. So thank you so much.
Yeah. We have a few minutes, so why don't we, comments, questions? We'll use every minute we have.
Yeah.
Maxine or Stefan.
I was very intrigued by the question that you asked at the outset. Earlier this morning, in some ways it's very a synchronicity that earlier this morning I was sitting with the deans of 2 colleges of ed, and we were talking about the fact that in Seattle Public Schools, where I serve as a board member, we're not getting the graduates who are capable of taking the positions that we have. And we were discussing the question that you asked, which is what is the better environment for new teachers to go into? A placement where they're put with a really high quality teacher versus one where they're in an environment that is going to be, that mirrors the environment they're going to spend their time in. And so it was a provocative question to then come into this room and hear you raise that. And so I'm curious if you can speak more about where you fall on that issue.
So again, I don't ask myself that question anymore, which is better. The question I ask now is, no matter where my student teacher is placed, how am I going to facilitate his or her learning in relation to those conditions and in relation to the goals that I have for him or her. So if she's in a classroom where they aren't using the mandated curriculum at all, but I know she has to use it next year, how would I facilitate in relation to that? If he's in a classroom where the teacher's reading from a script, how am I going to facilitate in relation to that? So I don't think there's a perfect placement. Or maybe if there are, they're 1 in a million. And that's never going to be enough to run a program on, right? So it's actually kind of fundamentally pushing us to rethink kind of what we think student teaching can do, but and to look beyond the placement itself, to think about how the conditions that we create for learning in relation to it, that's going to make all the difference.
Can I push on that just a little bit
Yeah.
and say that it's been our experience that too frequently that first placement is a level setting placement.
Yeah.
That it establishes the potential of that teacher to then become a high functioning teacher or just kind of middle, low functioning teacher, that first placement. And so
And I didn't talk about that today, but we also found that sequence was really important.
okay.
So having a strong, well, that there were, yeah, go ahead.
So as someone that oversees has some influence on a large system, I grapple with, well, what do you do with that? Do you want to put your teachers with the highest performing teachers, or do you want to put them in situations where they actually will, you give them a year of preparation for the environment that they're going to be in? And do you lose something when you put them in that second choice if they're not with a high performing teacher? And if they're, frequently it is a clear choice because you can't get the high performing teacher. You can't carve off their time because they're so desperately needed to perform at that school.
Well, I think a couple of things. One is, I think the point you're bringing up is hugely important, and placement offices oftentimes don't think about placements in that way, about saying, well, we probably don't want to have them in 2 high-performing placements or 2 low-performing placements, that we need them to see both. But again, for the student teachers who were actually in placements where they were in a high-performing setting, or they saw a really strong teacher in one and not a strong teacher in the other, they still weren't able to transfer what they saw in the high-performing to the other one. Because for the most part, student teaching was still conceptualized as independent practice and not guided practice, not guided by a teacher educator. And so, I mean, really what I'm suggesting is that the triad model that we have doesn't really work. And that we kind of have to blow that apart to think about what it would really look like to facilitate somebody's learning in context in relation to these bigger goals that we have for their learning.
And so by triad, you mean
I mean
just kind of the
student
immersion
teacher,
in
I
it?
mean the student teacher, the field supervisor, and the cooperating
Oh, okay.
teacher. Yeah, because the structure we have set up right now doesn't really enable us to mediate in the way that we really need to. Kat?
So I'm so impressed with this work in terms of how richly you describe what we could do and might and should do around strong, more intentional strategic mediation of student teaching. But I'm just really struck by the vision is really about people coming together and working more collaboratively and
Yes.
cooperatively and intimately. And even though I think Ken is kind of carrying the flag around this idea of democratizing teacher education now, John Goodlad made many of the same arguments 20, 30 years ago as Ken has taught us, actually. So that vision died on the same rocks that I'm very worried that our current initiatives are going to die on, and that is if you expand that kind of micro-analysis to a larger organizational analysis of teacher education using the chat tools, I think you'd be actually making contact with the things that make me hopeful but not optimistic about our ability to sustain these practices and actually build them, because we still have rules and divisions of labor that are absolutely inimical to this. We still have not transferred budget from coursework to fieldwork. And when we do that, then we'll be making progress, because
I agree with you 100%,
Yeah, I know you do.
and I think we could open that door of what does it mean to have teacher ed situated in a research university, and all of the kind of that institutional context means, and the little analysis that we did of my mediation of these student teachers' work. I was working with a small group in a small program, and that's part of why we looked at it. I mean, I was with those student teachers almost every day. They wrote 5 journal entries a week, and I responded to all of them. Now I think, oh my God. But I was actually intimately connected with what was going on with them as learners. I knew them really well, and I knew the context for learning really well. So in many ways, it's an argument against large-scale teacher ed, right? That it's really saying, like, we're too big. We're too big, and the triad model doesn't work within that big structure. That we really, and I think that's where the practice-based approaches are so promising, in that it starts to kind of really, it doesn't just mess with pedagogy, but it messes with the structure, right? Even within a big program. But then when the triad model exists right next to it, and we're still dealing with those kind of same persistent problems. So I'm agreeing with you, Kat.
Yeah, I'm not
Unfortunately.
confused about that. But you're about to have lunch, I think, with our program director. So to make the question more practical, where would you start in terms of organizational transformation, organizational change, to make this more practicable in terms of our ongoing practice?
Okay. And I'll give you a little speech. I mean, for me, it means that the university, like full-time faculty, and people have been saying this forever, have to be more engaged with the work that's happening in the field. It can't just be farmed out to field supervisors. And there have to be opportunities in coursework, and not just methods classes like Elham teaches that are out in schools and where they're engaging with classroom teachers, but in even the traditional classes that are here on campus. What are the opportunities that student teachers have to bring in the kinds of struggles, the tensions right, from their placements. Not just design a lesson, right, but to bring in the real tensions around learning and developing practice from inside their classrooms, and then having assignments that push them to kind of make sense of those, and where the instructor can facilitate their learning in very individualized ways, right? That bring together the coursework and the fieldwork. I mean, we just don't do that very well. So, but that's also because it's been really easy to assume that the fieldwork is somebody else's responsibility.
We're gonna have to
So-
close it off here. So thanks, Jamy.